on Warframe Wednesdays, I'm going to be bringing you guys my final thoughts, my final discussion on the new player experience inside of Warframe. Pushing past the 200-hour mark right about now. Took a break from the cinematic story quest to mess around with some other stuff, but I'm going to be getting back to the War Within this week. I'm very excited about that. And I understand 200 hours isn't really much by typical Warframe standards, but I think I've reached a point where I've kind of wrapped up the new player experience, or at least played enough of Warframe that I feel like I have some final thoughts, some final things to say about what DE could do, what they shouldn't do when it comes to improving that new player experience. It's such a popular topic with games like Warframe, EVE Online, and it's easy to see why. They're games that have a lot of complexity, a lot of depth, at least initially. They have relatively steep learning curves, and much of the community, even the veterans, are constantly concerned with how new people are going to get interested in the game, and I totally understand that. However, there's something that Steve Sinclair said in Danny O'Dwyer's no-clip documentary for Warframe that I found very interesting, that I think definitely altered my perspective on what I'd like to see DE do with the new player experience, what they can do, what they should do, if you will. In that interview, Sinclair talks about Star Wars Galaxies. He references Galaxy's attempt to modify and iterate on their new player experience dozens and dozens of times. The interesting end result they got was that player retention never increased or decreased. It stayed exactly the same, regardless of what they did to their new player experience. He said they've had a similar situation with Warframe, and I think we can say the true of games like EVE Online. You know, EVE Online constantly talking about its new player experience. Every time they have a convention, here's what we're doing for the new player experience, and it seems to make little difference. His reasoning behind that, I think, was just very clear and very straightforward. Most people boot up a game like Warframe, like Star Wars Galaxies, like EVE Online, and they can immediately tell whether or not it's for them. They can say right from the get-go, this is really deep. Oh, most of the questions I have don't seem to be answerable anywhere within the game. Looks like I'll have to go to outside resources. Yep, I like this already. Or, oh, no way. I don't have the time to commit to this, or I'm just not interested in this. It's a polarizing experience. I completely agree with him on that. And I think it makes a lot of sense when we sit here and we endlessly try and brainstorm ways in which new players can become addicted or hooked on Warframe. I think we have to clearly realize that you're never going to get the person who's already on the no side of the fence to come to the yes side of the fence. It's very rare that someone who looks at Warframe and decides this isn't for them is going to change their mind. And I don't think there's anything you can do to Warframe that is going to change their mind outside of completely altering what Warframe is. And obviously that's not what we want, which is what I've stressed every single time I've talked about the new player experience. We don't want to make Warframe infinitely accessible. It's a huge problem in the AAA industry right now. I mean, they're pushing accessibility into these games beyond the need for accessibility. There's a difference between giving players alternate control schemes, making sure they can maybe turn on certain parts of the HUD to assist them if they have a disability, and just making the game so accessible that it reaches out to an audience that doesn't even exist. Huge problem in AAA right now. We don't want to see that infection come to Warframe, and I don't think we have any concern about that because DE would never let that happen. Plain and simple, you can't change the heart of Warframe. You can't make it any more accessible at its core. So, what could DE do to, rather than worry about bringing new players on board, worry more about keeping the players who already decide they like Warframe a little bit more invested in the experience? How do we improve the new player experience in a way that just makes that new player experience for the player that already decides this is for me just a bit more enjoyable? And I think the number one thing I've kept coming back to are those story missions. We talked a little bit about this when I talked about my time with the Second Dream and with the Nata quest. The idea that those cinematic quests really open up Warframe as a completely different experience. You know, for the first time since Warframe was even created, there are stories and story arcs that really expand the greater universe of Warframe. Warframe was initially born as just a gameplay-focused experience. It had very little storytelling to it. Much of it was just background lore, slowly being developed by DE, and, you know, probably some of it just surmised by the community. But there wasn't really anything like we have now. Now, the problem is, most of those really great story arcs exist and are designed to exist very late into the player experience, you know, past the 50-hour mark, depending on who you play with and how fast you get there. There's very little in the way of the first, 0 to 20 hours to teach the player about the greater universe of Warframe. And I'm not saying they should take any of those quests from the late game and move them to the front of the experience. We don't want to give everything away, and there should obviously be a slow burn of the player's knowledge and acquisition of knowledge about the universe, but there's almost nothing at the start of the game. There's very little there to say, hey, this is the Grineer, this is the Corpus. Most of it is just done through passive dialogue with the Lotus or with Ortis. So actually having some early game micro cinematic quests that say, here's the background of the Grineer, the background of the Corpus, for example, I think could go a long way in, again, just further investing players who already have decided they want to invest in Warframe. Because I do think there is a good chunk of people who boot up Warframe and say, man, I like the depth this game has, but then maybe struggle to become attached to the world emotionally. You know, gameplay mechanics are great, and falling into the core loop, you know, understanding how to build out your first Warframe and the grind of the game, if you will, material acquisition, blueprints, that stuff's fun. You know, when you dive into that, you dive into the mod system and the damage system and you start to wrap your head around it, that stuff's all great, but it takes a while to get there. And I think if there's one hook we could have along the way to keep players just a little bit more invested, a little bit more excited and interested about their future with Warframe, it could be more of those storytelling components. Stories in general are just very powerful things for us as humans, and I would love to see Warframe have more of that. Even as someone who's now past that point, if suddenly there were a bunch of early game quests that I could go back and replay that maybe further introduced the Grineer or the Corpus, I'd be all over that. I'd totally go back and be like, wow, this is cool. And I think it would make it just a little bit easier to introduce friends to the game for the first time, because they'll dive in and they'll be like, wow, man, I could play this game for thousands of hours. And I'm like, yeah, dude, just wait till you start to really understand the world and the universe. And they slowly start getting introduced into the story components of the Warframe universe. Now I just feel like there's a better chance of them like sticking with it, a better chance of them saying, man, I'm excited about building this and building that, but this is just a really cool place to be. And I think that's the one thing in general that I'd like to see Warframe continue to iterate on, making it a really cool place to be. My favorite sci-fi universes, my favorite sci-fi experiences, whether they be in books or in film or in video games, are places that I just want to be, places that I want to spend time. Warframe already does a good job of that from a gameplay perspective, you know, giving us our own landing ship and letting us decorate it and, you know, just exist within it and open different portions of it is super cool. But let's layer on top of that with some of those story components. Make that connection to the player emotionally just a little bit deeper and a little bit stronger right from the get-go. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. My final thoughts on that new player experience. I think the answer is always far more complex than we will ever imagine. I do think DE is doing a good job of considering what's important, which is why we see them so often focused on what's next, what's happening down the line, new content, new innovation. I think that's a smart thing to do for this sort of game, but I do hope at some point in time they will have the time and the resources to go back and say, can we do anything to the beginning of a player's Warframe experience that doesn't necessarily make the game more accessible, but that improves that experience as a whole, and maybe even enhances that experience for everyone, veterans and new players alike. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.